Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar this afternoon, wherever around the world you may be tuning in from. It's a very great pleasure today to be speaking with both Fritjof Capra and Daniel Wahl. And today we'll be talking about transformative change, sustainability and regeneration, three very big and related themes for this year. But just before we begin, I'd just like to provide a little bit of context behind this webinar and what we'll actually be talking about. The webinar is being brought to you by Fritjof Capra's Capra course, and it's also being supported and hosted by Gaia Education. So I'd also like to say a special hello to all the alumni of both Capra course and people who have done Gaia Education courses around the world who I know are joining us this afternoon. The big theme of this webinar is change, and we're going to be looking at transformative change from three different perspectives, but related perspectives. So we're going to start off looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, because there are some very important discussions to be had around just how big an impact they're currently having, and also how can we actually increase the impact by developing a more systemic awareness of what these metrics are and how we may help organizations and communities around the world understand them and implement them. We'll also be looking at the economic system and change within the economic system, because of course our economic problems are a result of underlying systemic issues. So these need to be explored as well. And then finally, we'll also be looking at any particular change that's required in our educational system. And of course, two big examples of changes to the way in which we're educating our young people and also the adult population is through online courses offered through both Gaia Education and Capra course. So just before saying hello to Fritjof and Daniel, I'd just like to mention very briefly Capra course, of which I've had the great pleasure to be a part of since inception and development as a platform. On Capra course, people are able to connect and learn directly with Fritjof Capra as Fritjof takes us through the systems view of life over a period of 12 lectures, which take place over 12 weeks. But it's much more than just having Fritjof transmit the theory and information about the systems view of life. It's a very interactive course, and of course people have the opportunity to enter into really quite deep and meaningful discussions with Fritjof. And of course, as we've evolved and as more people have taken the course is evolving with the input from past alumni. And it's been fantastic to see the fact that there have been a number of meetings in many different countries of alumni, and they're now contributing ideas to how we can take Capra course forward. So we'll be talking a little bit more about that later as well. But yeah, I'd very much like to welcome Fritjof and Daniel. Firstly, Fritjof, welcome to the webinar this afternoon.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure. It's nice to see you both again. Since our first webinar, I have been to two very interesting conferences, one in Florence in Italy, and just recently another one in Chile. And I learned some really interesting things in both, and I'll be talking about that, so I will update you on my latest thinking. So it's a pleasure to be with you both and to have this opportunity of addressing all these people out there around the world.
Thank you, Fritjof. And also, Daniel, you join us from Spain this evening. So welcome to the webinar, Daniel.
Thank you very much for inviting me again. I really enjoyed the first conversation. I'm really looking forward to this one. And since we last talked in July, my big news is that I've become a father. So that has really deeply transformed me. I now have a 6-month-old daughter, and learning from her every day.
Yeah, exactly. It's incredible when you change your perspective, you know, who exactly we can learn from. So I'd like to start off this discussion talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. I work as a consultant in business, and it's really interesting to see which businesses are really looking at the Sustainable Development Goals as a north, as guidance for their own particular transformation. But then there are a number of studies and surveys which suggest that maybe quite a lot of businesses and organizations haven't been engaging with the Sustainable Development Goals, as maybe many people would have liked to have seen. So firstly, Fritjof, I'd love to hear just a little bit about you, about the Sustainable Development Goals. There are many different goals, and taken individually, each goal very much makes sense. But in terms of how we can actually help both communities, countries, governments, and organizations develop, what's your perspective on the Sustainable Development Goals?
Simon, I've had a problem with the whole concept of sustainable development for a long time. And the reason, as we discussed in our previous webinar, is that development is used in two very different senses by biologists and ecologists on the one hand, and economists on the other. Biologists use development in a broad, qualitative sense as a multifaceted unfolding, living organisms, ecosystems, or communities reaching their full potential. Economists tend to narrow this down to a single economic dimension mentioned in terms of per capita GDP. So the entire human existence is sort of compressed into this linear quantitative concept. But as I have studied the Sustainable Development Goals in more detail, I came to realize that the SDGs, as they are often called, actually embrace this broader concept of development, because the goals are about health, about literacy, about education, about all kinds of things. And I couldn't help being reminded of the Earth Charter. I'm a member of the Earth Charter Council, and so I've studied the Earth Charter in quite detail. And there's a difference between the two, because the Earth Charter is a declaration of 16 values and principles. It's essentially an ethical framework, whereas the SDGs, of course, as the name says, are goals, are concrete goals to achieve things. Nevertheless, it's interesting to map the SDGs onto the Earth Charter, and I can recommend this very highly, and the mapping is actually very good. In my opinion, the Earth Charter principles are somewhat more coherent and more internally consistent. And that's maybe part of the process, because the Earth Charter went through a very long process of global consultation. And especially, I have really only one critique of the SDGs, and that is in the goal, let me see, number 8, it says decent work and economic growth. And then when you go into detail, by growth they mean GDP growth, the growth of the gross domestic product. And that's really inconsistent with sustainability, because the GDP is an economic index that sums up indiscriminately all economic activities, whether it's beneficial or harmful. And so this is totally outdated now and needs to be replaced. So, but apart from that, I think the SDGs are great. And I look forward to hearing more from Daniel, because Daniel, you have worked with them for a long time.
Shall I go straight in?
Yeah, please.
I had, in my work with Gaia Education, I was challenged shortly after the SDGs were ratified in September 2015 to explore whether we could put together a course that would promote the SDGs and engage local communities with the SDGs. And in doing the research for that, I came across exactly the same issue that Fritjof already highlighted, that goal number 8 undermines all the other 17 goals if it's thought of in terms of GDP increase and the continued growth addiction that we have on the planet. There's a fundamental flaw in the way that we've designed our economic and monetary system through compound interest that necessitates growth for this cart house to stay up. And we need to have a conversation around redesigning our economic systems in order to implement all the SDGs. But what I've noticed since Gaia Education works as a grassroots educational initiative around the world, and very much with people who are activists and engaged in change at the bioregional or the local level, that just like you were saying, Simon, that business is a little bit slow in engaging. Civil society and the grassroots sector, so to speak, is also very slow in engaging because they see this, they have a certain fear that the entire UN process has been hijacked by the neoliberal agenda and by large corporations. And in the work that I've been doing, I've designed a set of cards for Gaia Education, which are basically to help people run workshops. There's on each card, there's a little bit about each SDG, and there's a bit of information on using the 4-dimensional curriculum that Gaia Education uses, ecological, economic, social, and worldview, to look at the SDG. And then in the colorful boxes, there are questions. And really, the idea behind this workshop is that people engage, like the facilitator has as little to do as possible and really just brings people together, puts them into small groups, and then gives them these question cards so they can have an intelligent conversation about what does the SDGs, well, what do the SDGs mean to us in this community, which SDGs are particularly important to us, and what can we do to implement them. And in that sense, these cards and the training of multipliers that goes along with it is sort of what I'm hoping to do with it is to sort of counter-co-opt the SDGs and make them more local again and give people a voice in how these overall goals, which, as Fritjof said, are very systemic and are good, apart from goal number 8, could actually become much more meaningful at the local level. And so people engage with, like, for me, the big opportunity behind the SDGs is that so far we find it difficult to do multi-stakeholder processes and to actually bring the public authorities, the business sector, and the civil society organizations together around a common goal, working in place for that place. And I think the SDGs have that opportunity of offering this bridge to have these deeper conversations. And in order to do so deeply, we need to address the issue about goal number 8. But I often find, rather than rejecting them outright, they're kind of the thin end of the wedge. They open a door, and once you have everybody in a multi-stakeholder process and a conversation, then people can layer deeper meanings onto them and kind of adjust the bits where there is an incongruency, which is the one that with continued economic growth measured in terms of GDP, we will not be able to implement the other SDGs.
You know, Daniel, in my online course, I discussed the Earth Charter, and I have drawn a systemic map, which I don't know how much you can see, but this is what it looks like, of all the 16 principles and how they are interconnected. And this leads us to very interesting discussions of systemic thinking and of mapping. And I wonder whether you have done this with the SDGs, because it would be very interesting also to see how they're interconnected and where maybe something is still missing. And that would be a very interesting exercise.
I haven't done it in that format, but I remember that map because I really enjoyed the Capra course. Remember, I was on, you kindly gave me a ticket, and I really enjoyed it a couple of years ago. But the Stockholm Environment Center has done this alternative map of the SDGs. And what I like about it is that it puts 2 rings. It's called the wedding cake graphic of the SDGs. And it at least the ecosystem services, the land on water, land and water, life in water, life on land, and climate it puts it as the basis, and then society is the next level, and economy kind of on top of it, indicating in this graphic that without getting the ecosystem's functions repaired and generating more abundance, we will not have healthy societies, and we won't have a healthy economy. And the economists tend to look at these kind of graphics the other way around. Everything is the economy, and within it sits a little bit called society, and somewhere in the corner sits something called environment. And of course, that's why we're in the mess we're in.
Yeah, I think we will come back to that when we talk about the economy in our next section. But that is very important, that the economy has to be integrated within society, and then society within the natural environment. You're quite right.
Yeah. I think it's very interesting that, I think the cards are really interesting in terms of how they can really help facilitate and generate much deeper dialogues. This is part of some of the work we've been doing here in Brazil. And when you have this approach to dialogue, it's really interesting looking at how there are some major organizations that actually understand the challenges related to a mindset that says, no, it's just unlimited growth. And in fact, it's really interesting and actually quite heartening to see that, well, some companies are looking at both regeneration, and maybe we could also use the word flourishing as well, and understanding that they cannot progress in any meaningful way now without meaningful participation from the communities in which they're operating. And I've seen some great examples where maybe organizations have suffered from, some kind of physical attacks on installation. But when the companies realized that much more meaningful engagement was necessary with these rural communities, they changed things around. It did lead to engagement. It did lead to job opportunities in regenerative and sustainable technologies. And I think it's this aspect of dialogue that can really help move us away from this fixation with GDP growth.
Yeah, let me at this point tell you about the conference I went to in Florence. This was interestingly organized by the Vatican. The Vatican has an environmental organization called Green Accord, and they organized an international meeting on the green economy in Florence. And for me, the most interesting part was meeting Robert Costanza, whom I had never met before, but whose work I had known for a very long time. Costanza is one of the founders of what is called ecological economics. He was at the University of Vermont for a long time, and he's now in Australia at the University of Australia. And so he talked about this obsession with unlimited quantitative growth measured in terms of GDP. And it is obvious that on a finite planet, not everything can grow all the time. I mean, this is completely irrational, this obsession with unlimited quantitative growth. So he asked the question, why is there this obsession? And his answer was very interesting. It was a rhetorical question, but his answer is that it is an addiction. And he talked a lot about addiction and how to treat addiction. And so he explained that there is tremendous positive reinforcement in business and in politics. And there's a whole outdated infrastructure underlying this idea of GDP growth. And this is why, although there have been many attempts of devising new indicators, there's a European organization, a coalition of organizations called Beyond GDP in the UK. It's a coalition of government and non-government organizations. And there are various indicators that have been proposed, but such as the Human Development Index of the United Nations, something called Genuine Progress Indicator, or GPI, that Costanza also talks about. But a broad support for overturning GDP is missing. And so he's suggesting exactly what we have been talking about: local dialogues, community building, regional dialogues. And I should also mention, I should very highly recommend Costanza's book, which he wrote with a number of co-authors, and it's called An Introduction to Ecological Economics. It was published in 2015, the second edition, and he goes into great detail about alternative economic indicators. Oh, I want to add just one more thing, and that is somebody else at the same conference presented a very extreme example of this obsession, and that is the projections of fossil fuel companies about the growth of fossil fuels by 2040. This is really absolutely amazing. BP, Exxon, and Shell are forecasting in their official documents increases of fossil fuels by 2040 by 24% BP, 27% Exxon, and 37% Shell. Of course, you know, this would totally wreck the planet. This is totally unacceptable. But this is what they have in their documents. I mean, there's total denial of the ecological context.
This reminds me that I'm still involved in helping to curate a new initiative for the Commonwealth Secretariat, and Patricia Scotland, was the current Secretary General of the Commonwealth Secretariat. Mm. They launched in 2015 an initiative called Reversing Climate Change. And at the COP meeting in Marrakesh, Patricia Scotland went in front of the global leaders and for the first time said that we need to do more than just do mitigation and adaptation. We need to do climate change reversal. And that is very much aligned with the work that Paul Hawken has been doing with his book Drawdown, and bringing together all the different techniques that would draw carbon from the atmosphere. And what the agreement of Marrakesh really was is that so far we had the SDGs on one side and the climate agenda as, okay, one of the SDGs is addressing climate change, but they were never really brought together. And in Marrakesh, there was a clear understanding that we cannot move the climate agenda forward if we don't implement all the SDGs. And the way to move the climate agenda forward is actually by implementing the SDGs. And all of this kind of keeps, as our conversation keeps spiraling around this economic issue of redesigning the economic system. And of course, part of that is getting out of fossil fuels and getting into biomaterials and basically shifting from quantitative economic growth to qualitative economic growth, which means just like in nature, things don't continue growing exponentially. They have a logistic curve. They grow in a curve that looks very similar to the exponential curve initially, and then the curve flattens off. And as humanity, we need to do this off. And in my mind, it is about shifting large scale to bioregionally focused biomaterials economies that are as circular as possible, and shifting our entire material culture, because the addiction to fossil fuels isn't just about transport and about heating. It is about our entire material culture. We have a huge opportunity of innovation and transformative innovation by redesigning our material culture based on biomaterials, and in that process, draw down carbon from the atmosphere and put them into biomaterials.
Yeah. Daniel, I completely agree. And in my course, I have a long discussion about this shift from quantitative to qualitative growth. And I relate it to the systems view of life, which is essentially a science of qualities that is now emerging at the forefront of science. But Daniel, I have a question for you. And that is, when we talk about drawing down CO2 from the atmosphere, the only known and proved way of doing this is through the photosynthesis of plants. And so there's a tremendous importance of organic agriculture or agroecology, forestry, agroforestry, and agroecology. Does this appear anywhere in the SDGs?
In the SDGs, only indirectly.
Yeah.
But in terms of the strategies that are now being promoted both by Christiana Figueres's Mission 2020 and this Regenerative Development to Reverse Climate Change initiative of the Commonwealth Secretariat, is very much aware of, or Willem Verwede's initiative, if you haven't come across it yet, called the Common Land Foundation. They all focus on building a new economic system that is all about increasing the amount of standing forests, shifting from industrial agriculture to smaller scale organic agriculture, bringing the carbon into the soil, into standing trees, into biomaterials. Once the carbon has been fixed through photosynthesis into biomaterials, we can then lock this carbon into biomaterials by putting them into building or things that last very long and store carbon that way. But there is a step further. It's not enough to just do biological carbon sequestration. We need to move the carbon from the biological carbon cycle, which only is about 200-year cycling time, into the geological carbon cycle. And this is where the soil is so important, because mycorrhizal fungi and processes in the soil, I don't remember the technical term right now, but it's basically a symbiosis between fungi and plant roots that allow for the carbon to turn into carbonate, and through that make the shift from the biological carbon cycle into the geological, which is 10,000s of years.
Yeah. And this is extremely important, and I'm glad that you're connected with these initiatives. What I have observed is that we have a huge movement about climate change, right? 350.org and lots of organizations, very active. And then we have a huge movement about organic agriculture and food. And there's very little connection between the two. Although, as we just discussed, they are should be intimately connected, because drawing down CO2 with plants is the only way. So I'm glad that this is happening.
Absolutely.
All right. So, yeah, go ahead.
So this really, I think it's really interesting, because one of the things that Fritjof, you often say is that, there are systemic solutions to the systemic problems we face today. I'm not a critic of big business in general, because I see I see big business as being one potential solution in partnership with many other stakeholders. And I feel that by criticizing people in big business just through blanket criticism, I don't feel that's a constructive way forward. However, as you say, there are very much people active on climate change, organic agriculture, and also there are a lot of people looking at innovation, technologies as sustainable way forwards. But there isn't any great linking up at this moment in time. So my next question is, what does systems thinking teach us about how we can take these solutions, that are often tried and tested in specific contexts, and how can we scale them up? What kind of ways can we get involved to help truly scale up the solutions to the planetary scale that are needed today?
Well, I think there are many strategies that activists can follow, but if you ask me, my answer is education, because that's where I work. So with Capra course, we now have an alumni network, as you mentioned, of over 500 people. And the long-term goal is really to build up a network of systemic thinkers and activists. And I hope that sometime in the future, Daniel, we can interlink, as we're doing today in this webinar, we can interlink with Gaia Education and really strengthen this network of systemic thinkers and activists. So, you know, my answer is scaling up awareness and knowledge of both systemic thinking and systemic solutions that exist around the world.
I think it's really interesting to mention Capra course right now, because I personally have invited a number of different people onto the course who have a very commercial or business background. And I think one of the key things is it's not simply a case of telling people you have to now think in terms of systems. It doesn't work, because it's a very profound shift in our perception and our understanding. And I've had some really amazing comments from people who may be alone or single voices in different companies, but they've found the experience of taking Capra course very transformative. And they're now better able, it's almost as if they have a toolkit or a better way to really talk about systems thinking initially with their colleagues. And in this way, this is the initial stage of scaling up. We're not saying to people, oh, you need to cause a revolution in your organization, which may have 1,000, 2,000 people. It's been really interesting, you know, following people's progression as they've taken Capra course and then gone on to look at, you know, their career development after having taken the course.
Yes, what we're doing actually is, on the one hand, teaching a certain kind of knowledge, which I call the systems view of life, and on the other hand, building community. And learning within a community is extremely powerful, and that's what we're doing.
This is where there's a lot of synergy between the courses that Gaia Education offers, both online and face-to-face. They also run a course called Eco-Village Design Education, which is 125 hours of contact time. People come together to do the course. Because what underlies all of the work at Gaia Education is a four-dimensional whole systems design mandala, which I mentioned earlier. Instead of just using the three-legged stool of sustainability, the classic social, economic, and ecological, it adds worldview. And by adding worldview, it adds the systems view of life. Actually, your books are copiously referenced throughout the curriculum of this course, because I wrote part of the other course. And to come back to Simon's question about scaling up, there's a lot of talk about scaling up these days, and from good people who really want to scale up the change. And I think we need to be very careful that history, to my mind, has shown that even the most sustainable solutions that we've come up with, when you take them to a massive scale, they become unsustainable. And the wisdom that the Center for Ecoliteracy has shared with the world of basic principles of how nature organizes things, if we go back to them, we see that nature you don't keep growing a cell ever larger, you divide it. And so in a similar sense, I think it's not about scaling up, it's about spreading. And education plays a key role in spreading, because solutions always, in my own work, in my book, I talk a lot about elegant solutions carefully adapted to the biocultural uniqueness of place. Somewhat lending on my mentor, John Todd, with this work. And basically, we need to, in order to scale up solutions, we need to spread them, what works, the patterns behind it, the thinking, the systems thinking behind it, and then look at how does what worked in California work on a Mediterranean island? What is similar, what is different? How do I make it meaningful to the local cultures so people can engage with it? So for me, education is key, and a systemic way of thinking is key in the process of helping people not think that, oh, great, I like this little community-owned wind farm of 3 1.5 megawatt turbines. Why don't we do a big wind farm of 15,000 turbines all across the mountains of California? That's where things get often out of scale. And also, maybe being less solutions focused and more question focused, because things keep changing. And if we focus on the right question and keep learning, then we're much more likely to create a regenerative culture than if we lock in on solutions. There's a lot of this issue with technological lock-in, that once you've made a decision and you built a solution, then if the world changes, you're still stuck with your old solution that has become your new problem, because you're sweating assets.
I agree completely. I mean, we need to educate ourselves and educate each other to learn the basic principles of ecology and systemic thinking, and then we need to filter this through the local conditions and the local culture to create something that is lasting, sustainable, and effective. I can give you another example that I've seen some time ago. There's this initiative called the Natural Step, which was created by Karl-Henrik Robert in Sweden. It was tremendously successful in Sweden, but it didn't work in other parts of Europe. It didn't work in the United States because, you know, Sweden is a particular country and it was tailored to Swedish society. The Swedish actors, the king got involved, all kinds of things that worked extremely well. But you have to recreate it somewhere else, you know, in a different way. And that's true for most of these solutions.
It's interesting. The Natural Step has certainly influenced many different new ways of thinking about business. So, for example, there's an initiative called the Future Fit Business Goals, and this takes as its inspiration the Natural Step. And also the research group that I'm involved in, the Strongly Sustainable Business Model Group, which is based in Canada. They've been influenced by the Natural Step, and they're now really thinking about how do you actually design business models from this systemic perspective.
And Simon, I think, I think, Simon, the word inspiration is the key term here. So we need to be inspired by certain solutions, but not copy them, you know. We can copy certain things, but inspiration is the main issue.
Exactly, inspiration and creativity. Fritjof, I'd love to talk to you and Daniel a little bit more about this notion of living systems in the consistency of life, and how this, as both a metaphor and also theory, can really help us make this shift away from thinking, you know, especially shift our thinking in business from hierarchy, command and control. And I know you were recently with Umberto Maturana in Chile. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your conversations. I know a lot of people know that you were there with Umberto Maturana. Could you talk a little bit about autopoiesis and what the current thinking is in terms of how this particular theory can help inspire us?
Okay, well, let me put this into two parts. First, what is a living system? And the very core of the systems view of life is to say that metabolism is the central characteristic of life. Metabolism is defined as a constant flow of energy and matter through a network of chemical reactions. We're talking here about biological life, through a network of chemical reactions that allows a system to continually maintain itself, repair itself, and regenerate itself. Now, there are two aspects to this concept of metabolism, which is really the central concept. One is the flow of energy and matter, and the other one is the network of chemical processes. So there is an approach to life in terms of networks and in terms of flows. And my synthesis essentially is to synthesize these two approaches, networks and flows. In terms of networks, here's the work of where the work of Maturana and Varela comes in. Living networks, they discovered, are self-producing, self-generating networks. So a flow of energy and matter goes through a living organism, and the living organism is a network which continually changes structurally. That is, it continually transforms and replaces its components. And this allows the organism to survive in the long run and allows, say, an ecosystem to be sustainable. So the important lesson to learn is that living systems continually regenerate themselves. That's implicit both in metabolism and in the concept of autopoiesis, which literally means self-making. And so nature is sustainable because it is regenerative. That's the key lesson. And let me now come to my meeting with Umberto Maturana, whom I've known for many years, but hadn't seen in quite a long time. And so I was really happy to meet him. And the main thing I want to convey is that Maturana is now 89 years old. And we had a meeting in his home with a group of his students. The meeting, including lunch, lasted for 4 hours. And during those 4 hours, Maturana was totally concentrated, totally alert, remembered every single thing. He told us basically the story of autopoiesis, how he got to formulate this concept. He remembered every name, every year, every paper that he wrote. I was really amazed, you know, by his intellectual vigor and force. It was also a very, very affectionate, emotional, warm meeting, which I enjoyed tremendously. And let me just mention two things. Let me also say that I did not go there to discuss things with him or argue. I went there really to see him at the personal level. But he told us this long story of his work. And most of the story I knew because he has also published it. But what I didn't know was interesting. He said when he was 10 years old, when he was a child of 10, he had two main interests. One was to make toys. He made his own toys with his hands, and he constantly wanted to see how do things function. You know, how do you put things together? How do they function? And the other one was he was interested in what are living beings and what happens to them when they die. So these two questions. And it really struck me that many years later, in 1972, when he wrote the first version of Autopoiesis together with Francisco Varela, this was published in Spanish, and the title of the Spanish book is De Máquinas y Seres Vivos, of Machines and Living Beings. And those were his two interests in childhood, you know, the machines, the toys, and the living beings. So this is quite amazing. Then the other thing that he said, when he got seriously interested as a scientist in finding out what the essential nature of life is, he did not ask the question, what is life? He asked the question, how do living beings function? And he considered this a big difference because it was really something that was practical, that was operational, where he could study the functioning of living systems. And he came across this notion of circularity. That was his first time. the circularity of organization of living systems. And then it got expanded to the network, a network including cycles. And then finally, with Varela, they formulated this concept of autopoiesis. But it was really interesting. And my main message to our viewers is that, you know, Umberto Maturana is 89, but he's totally alive and alert and working and just in wonderful health and spirit.
Wonderful. I think mentioning Maturana, it was so nice to see that picture of you in his living room. For me, both Maturana and Varela also made a massive contribution, and you write about this a lot in your own work, Fritjof, with the so-called Santiago theory of cognition, which points out that an organism does this self-making through the first distinction between what is the environment and what is me, by creating a separation, but it's not a kind of separation that truly separates. The whole still stays a whole. In the terms of Henry Bothoft, who we all met at Schumacher College, it is still not a counterfeit whole, but a real whole, because the organism is in constant conversation with its environment through these flows and networks you mentioned. And as such, it is a scientific theory that bridges the Cartesian gap, that gets us out of this kind of thinking that humanity is separate from nature, or that the organism is, or the individual species, as Gregory Bateson said. When we think about life and survival, we make the mistake about thinking of it in terms of individuals and individual species, and don't understand that survival in the long term, in an evolutionary sense, is always the individual, the species, and the environment. And that this whole, like for me, the systems view of life is also a view of what Thich Nhat Hanh called interbeing, of life not being about individuals and species, life being a planetary process that, since life started on Earth, has continued to create conditions conducive to life, has created the oxygen that we're now breathing, has created the conditions for multicellular organisms to form, for social organisms to form. There is a telos in evolution, which is continued complexification, like a diversification, and then subsequent integration of that diversity at higher levels of complexity. But we never cease to be that whole process. We're not separate from it. And for me, that is a huge contribution of Maturana's work.
That's right. Now, Daniel, you're throwing out a wealth of concepts here and ideas. And, you know, this is why I'm teaching a whole course, because it really takes, you know, several hours to really lay it out. But you're completely right that you know, the Cartesian division is something that we have now overcome. Descartes, people will remember, had these two separate and independent realms, that of mind, which he called the thinking thing, res cogitans, and that of matter, the extended thing, res extensa. And so scientists and philosophers after Descartes for hundreds of years were wondering how this thinking thing interacts with matter. And the big progress of the systems view of life, the revolution really initiated by Gregory Bateson and Umberto Maturana, was to realize that mind is not a thing, mind is a process. So the relationship between mind and matter is one between process and structure, and everything else follows from that. But as I said, you know, this is involves a whole lot of concepts that need time to really be laid out.
That's why the viewers should sign up to the Capra course.
And I think it's really interesting talking about Capra course, because the concepts and theories that we discussed, they are very deep. They do need time to think about. But what we're seeing now in terms of the evolution of Capra course is that not only are individuals from their own organizations or businesses, or maybe just individuals as in their own right, they're not just applying on their own, what we're now seeing is, and I'm receiving requests from people saying, can we do Capra course as a group? So maybe, and this is a suggestion to people who are out there, maybe people who, there might be 5 people or 10 people who are in an organization. They may not necessarily, they may be wondering, well, how can I really get the most out of the Capra course? And the answer is to, you know, develop a study group, invite a small number of your colleagues to do it jointly, study together, watch the videos together, have meetings together. And we're seeing this more and more with even companies now coming to us and saying, look, we've got a small group here, can we join as a group? And absolutely. And this really is, I think, a key factor in really helping people get the very most out of their experience of taking Capra course.
All right. Well, yes, I look forward. The next course is going to start in March, and people are signing up already. And I really look forward to teaching it again. So, of course, you know, I know the lectures, so I don't watch my own lectures, but I'm online every day during the course, interacting with people, and I really enjoy this because it's new for me. It's a new experience. And it's quite different from teaching in the classroom. In the classroom, you know, I teach, and then people ask questions, and I tended to have my courses, for example, at Schumacher College, very informally. People could ask questions throughout the lecture, but when somebody asks a question, I have to give an answer. And most of the time, the question is not all that well formulated. And most of the time, well, sometimes I know the perfect answer, but, you know, most of the time I sort of talk around it, you know, till I find the right approach. Whereas in Capra course, the question is posted, people have time to think before they think a lot before they pose the question. And I usually, you know, go online in the morning and look what's up in the network, in the discussion forum, you know, then I go and shave and brush my teeth and have breakfast, and I think about the questions, you know, and by the time I answer them, I really have a well-formulated answer. And not only do I answer the question, I also give additional references to books, I may post links of videos, I may refer to other discussions that we had already. So it's really very substantial. I miss the face-to-face interaction, but in exchange, you get much more substantial discussions, which I really enjoy.
One thing that, because Simon mentioned Capra course always evolving, and particularly through the input of people. One thing that works really well for the online courses at Gaia Education is that these often very disparate groups from dialing in from all over the world are always asked to put what they've learned into some kind of practice by joining together as design teams and applying what they've learned to a specific design project. It can be the design of an educational initiative or of a small eco-village or a transition town initiative, or even redesigning a business, coming up with a new business plan. And that step from turning information and knowledge into application is really where a much deeper learning takes place, and also where peer-to-peer learning takes place.
Yeah, that's excellent.
So maybe exploring that as a possibility where you give people, as Simon mentioned, that there are already groups signing up, giving people the opportunity to actually practice what they learned by applying it.
Yeah, I think that's really worth pursuing, to also in Capra course to form design groups. You know, now that we have alumni that are becoming, you know, more and more numerous, we could suggest forming design groups. That's very interesting. Oh, let me just mention one piece of good news that emerged while I was in Chile. I now have a Latin American publisher for my textbook, The Systems View of Life, which I co-authored with Pier Luigi Luisi, there is a new university in Costa Rica, which is called National Technological University. And they are going, I think, 4 or 5 years old, and they are focusing on systems thinking and sustainability, and they're going to produce a Spanish version of the Systems View of Life, and they've started the translation already. So I'm very excited about this, because the whole, not only Spain, but Latin America, the Spanish-speaking Latin America is a huge field where people have been asking me for years and years, can they read my books in Spanish? And now I'm very happy to be able to offer the textbook in Spanish.
That's fantastic news, because I know a lot of people who've read you in Portuguese, Fritjof, and now to have that Spanish edition as well. It's a wonderful, that's great news.
That's great.
I also wanted to just briefly mention two pieces of news, like coming back to one thing that Simon mentioned earlier with the strongly sustainable business model group. What I wanted to interject there was in June in Amsterdam, there's a conference of the Reporting 3.0 initiative, which I'll also be speaking at. And they're really very much taking this approach that you spoke to. They're very linked to the strongly sustainable business model group. And so if people are interested, watch that space. And actually tomorrow I'm leaving for Lyon, and Ashoka, because we were talking about education in general and how to create transformative change in education. Ashoka, the social entrepreneurs network, has started a new initiative called the Global Change Leaders Initiative. And it's focused on education. And they've been running for about 2 years with smaller local meetings. And in Lyon tomorrow, we'll start a meeting of over 200 educators from around the world to really look at building new types of ecosystems of education. That the goal of this week that I'm going to is nothing less than to put the first few steps on the long road of deeply transforming education for all ages, from kindergarten to pensioners. And I'm very much looking forward to bringing, I go there as a messenger, I go there as a weaver between different initiatives. And I will mention Capra Course, I will mention Gaia Education. I'm going as a Gaia Education representative, because I think the time is ripe for these, as Buckminster Fuller said, call me trim tab. I like to say trim tabs unite. In order to transform, like to get to global transformation quick enough and respond to the crisis, we need to bring these different initiatives in education, in business, and so on together. So I'm excited. There's already something called the We Mean Business Alliance working on climate change, and now there seems to be a global alliance forming of really innovative educationalists trying to work together to redesign education. Because as Fritjof pointed out, the way to get to scale is by working with education. We need to empower people so they can apply sensible solutions at the local level in the way that makes sense to them and to the place.
Yeah, I'm very happy that you're doing this, Daniel, and please convey my greetings when you mention the course. And also my message would be about leadership. You know, there are 2 characteristics of leaders that we need today: systemic thinking, to understand how all the problems in the world are interdependent and interlinked, and how they require systemic solutions. And the other one is what Václav Havel, in his memorable phrase called a moral compass. That is, we need to put ethics and values on the table. Just to give 2 examples of why ethics is so important. If all the companies in the world and all the wealthy people in the world were to pay their fair share of taxes rather than hiding away their money in tax shelters, there would be no economic crisis anywhere in the world, because there's enough money to do all the things we need to do if people are honest and ethical. And the other one would be if fossil fuel companies were ethical, you know, we would have curbed greenhouse gas emissions many, many years ago. So ethics is really important to put it on the table together with systemic thinking.
I think that's a wonderful way to finish, because I know a lot of people watching this broadcast today. We have people who are already in leadership positions looking to develop their systems thinking further, and who are already implementing systemic solutions. And there's also the younger generation listening today who are looking to move into, and who will be moving into leadership positions. So thank you very much, Fritjof, for finishing with this like stirring call to action.
You're welcome.
So yeah, thank you.
I must say, I really enjoyed this conversation with you both, and I can't wait for the next one. We should make this a tradition. And, you know, as we go around participating in various meetings and initiatives and activism, if we meet so every 6 months or so, or every 2 or 3 months even, and exchange ideas, and this is wonderful.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it too. And thank you, Simon, for hosting the conversation so skillfully, and thank you.
Yeah. So thank you once again to Fritjof, to Daniel, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. We really appreciate your comments. You've been commenting throughout our talk, and both Daniel and I were on social media. We very much welcome the conversation continuing, and of course, as it will do with Capra course, which starts on March the 7th. I'm really looking forward to those conversations. So until next time, bye for now.